Welcome back, West Point family, to the latest in our Condition Book podcast series. I'm Joe Bianca. I'm an ownership advisor at West Point Thoroughbreds, joined as always by Executive Vice President Tom Bellhouse and COO Aaron Birkenhauer. Welcome, guys.
Thank you, Joseph.
Good to see you,
Happy
as
Joe.
always. Very, very popular first episode, so we're thrilled about that. Thank you to all the partners who watched and commented. I think it's a really good service for the partners and for us to just talk these things out as well. We promised that we were in the upcoming episodes, we were going to drill down on specific horses that we've had difficulty placing and difficulty managing because there aren't the spots that you want for them along the way. There's hardly ever a perfect spot. Let's start with a horse that's, I think, is to me the most popular horse in the short time that I've been at West Point, was Voodoo. He was a really nice horse who won a couple allowance races, but got into that kind of middle ground where there wasn't a ton for him in the book. Tom, why don't you take us through Voodoo Zip's career and why it was so difficult to find a suitable race for him?
Thanks, Joe. I think, Voodoo is the, as we've called him for years, he's the people's horse. He's the kind of, I call him like the perfect partnership horse, because you get a great group of people and he runs a lot, to have 20 something starts with us, and the partners, he really was a New York horse where all the partners came to Belmont and Aqueduct and Saratoga. And we just really, it was a great group of people, and a close bond, formed with a lot of these partners, that they keep in touch and they do things together. And it's really been a wonderful experience. If you look back, Joe, at the beginning of his career, he started his career. He's a City Zip that we bought at OBS. Actually, we bought him post sale, if I'm not mistaken, Aaron. I think he didn't meet the reserve, and we went back and we bought him from the McCathin brothers. Is that right?
Yes, it was one of the very few times we've done that in our history, but it was right after one of the brothers had just passed away, so things were a little bit chaotic, and we were able to get the deal done after he left the ring.
Yeah, I think at the time we felt that they were a little aggressive with their reserve, but we really liked them, and we've always been fans of City Zip. We've had a number of City Zips in the stable, and obviously out of a bluegrass cat mare, we were, it was just something about him. He was a really middle, not overly big, but very balanced, athletic type horse. So, I'm sorry?
He thinks he's big.
He thinks he thinks he's the toughest guy in the barn, no doubt. And as the years went on, we could talk about that. He became he really had a mind of his own. But if you look at this trainer data graphic, he started his career with Danny Gargan, and he had a couple of just insane beats. And the one that sticks out in my head, I think, is the one on at Gulfstream. I believe that's April 5th. And he lost to a horse named Gaffoe, who ended up being a grade 1 winner. Oh, that's a different one. That was, I was wrong. It was off one. He lost.
Is this what you call a professional maiden?
That's what I thought, looking at him.
Look at the horses he's getting beat by, though. They're all stakes horses. It's like you look back and he's like, oh, he can't break through. And, so here we are, we lose by a nose at Gulfstream. And, I think we're all just about beside ourselves. It's like, this guy ever going to win? And he had his aches and pains a little bit, his growing pains. And at that point, now, when did we give him a break? I'm trying to see on here. He got a little bit of a break from June of 20. So we ran him one time more there, and it was just like, you know what? He's a little achy, he's a little ouchy, he's going through some growing pains. Our trainer at the time felt, either we give him a break or we got to run him for a tag because he's just not going to break through. And his numbers were super solid for a young horse. And he's losing. And, obviously we have a relationship with Clement. So we knew Gaffoe was in the barn working with Decorated Invader. It was a horse they were very excited about. Obviously became a multiple grade 1 winner. But, he finally comes, we make the trainer change, which we don't do a lot, but, we figure we give him a fresh start. Here he is. He's a 4-year-old now, maiden. So for those of you who are sitting there and you're like, oh, my horse hasn't broken through yet, he hasn't gotten a win and he's 3. Imagine what these Voodoo Zip partners are feeling. Here the horses won 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times. Now, granted, never out of the money, always right there. And then he breaks through with a nice win, and we get that win at Gulfstream Park with Joe Bravo. So then we start his career, normal, what you would consider basically a normal career. We're finding out that he basically doesn't really want to go as far as we originally thought, which isn't shocking with a city zip, but he'd won at a mile, and he won at 7.5. He broke his maiden. And then, the Clamonts really settle in that he's a come from behind sprinter. And if you look, and he's a winner, all of a sudden he starts wheeling off some wins. He goes, now win is a 1, now win is a 2, now win is a 3. And that's where it gets interesting. Now we're at that point in his career. He's either basically a stake horse, or we have to figure out something else. So here he is. He's running, at Belmont. He runs on May 29th of 22. He wins that race. I mean, I remember him coming off the break from November to April, and he didn't run well in that race at Gulfstream Park at all. Just didn't like it. And so we're like, okay, but that happens off a break.
He ever threw for us was that day at Gulfstream. I mean, it was just, for him to throw a clunker, you were just like, what?
Yeah, because look at his whole career. He never finished worse than third. And here he is on April 22nd, and he really just had a horrible trip. I mean, he didn't break well. He got bumped. I mean, it's just really a bad day at the office. And quite honestly, maybe farther than he wanted to go. So here we are. And I remember telling people and being at this race at the top of the stretch, I'm going, we might be in trouble. The voodoo zip that we know might not exist anymore. And that happens with horses. We'll sit there and we'll look at horses' careers, and some aren't the same from 2 to 3. Some aren't the same from 3 to 4. And with older horses, sometimes all of a sudden it's okay, that's it. It's just not the same. And he was coming back as a 5-year-old, and because he broke his maiden in 2021. Here we are in 2022. He's a 5-year-old. And in that last 1/8 of a mile, Rosario rode him. I don't know what happened, but it was like a jetpack, and he just closed. And he was the heavy favorite. He was even money, but we all just sat there just in disbelief that how he ran. And it was exciting. So as you see, we went up to Graded Stakes Company up at Woodbine. The 6 furlong was really 6 to 7 was 1 turn, seemed to be his wheelhouse. We ran a credible race that day. Dylan, he left a lot to do. We still only got beat 2 lengths. We come back in the fall. Now, we didn't really run at Saratoga very often. We did that year, but the 5.5 was just a little too short for him. And then you go through and we're running, competitive in graded stakes and stuff. But basically it comes down to, after a while, the horse isn't making any money. And, trainers, for those of you, you think, okay, a trainer gets paid by us on a day rate. Trainers don't really make a living off the day rate. They basically barely cover their staff and the wages with the day rate. If you have a trainer who's trying to make a living off the day rate, it's cut rate. You could just see it in their barns. It's, you go into the barns of a Clamont or Shug or Bill Mott or Todd Pletcher, you see the straw, that each horse lays on. I mean, just that they don't cut corners. And so basically a trainer makes his living off the purses. And when horses like this are moving forward and they're knocking on the door, but they're really not making any money to speak of, the trainer wants to run where they can be competitive and win, because that's how they get paid. So what we were is he's already won the A other than, the 2 other than, the 3 other than. They don't really write 4 other thans. So what we're looking for at this point is a 3 other than that. If we talk about how they write a condition, it would be, we write here's when we look up on a race, up here on the right on this screen tells you the conditions. It's for 4-year-olds and up, which have never won 18,000 3 times other than maiden, claiming, or starter. or state bred, or which have never won 4 races, or which have not won a race in 2013, or you can run in the race for a tag of 80,000. So at the time, we didn't want to run the horse for a tag if we could help it. So we were looking for that date, so to speak, in that where it says a horse that has not won a race in 2023. So because we've already won this condition, we've won the 3 other than, you're always looking for something in the conditions here that would make you eligible to compete without running for the tag or without running in stakes company. And in New York, Aaron, if you want to go back to Voodoo's career, they didn't use that date very often. So if you look towards 2023, June 4th, we had run in the Elusive Quality. We didn't run well. He got jostled. He had a rough trip, and he just wasn't running well. Well, basically, Christoph said, he's just not going to win a stakes at this point of his career. Now he's a 6-year-old. He's not running, he's running solid numbers, but he's not running graded stakes numbers. And we go up to Canada where they write that 3 other than, and they give us the date, which allows us to be in there. Well, after that day, the New York Racing Office started adding a date to all of the 2 other than and 3 other, the 3 other thans. So we were able to come back and have the opportunity to run him back in New York on the following race. And at that point, we gave him a freshening. We knew Saratoga, the distances weren't ideal. And we sent him and gave him a shot to run for big money out of Kentucky Downs. And he ran competitively, but unfortunately he was clean. And obviously his new connections have really only run him on dirt, and it gave him a shot on poly, which quite honestly, it made very little sense to us at the time that somebody would claim him unless they wanted to give him a shot to be a contender on synthetic. But when we talk about conditions and going through your conditions, he's the perfect example that once you get through your conditions and once you run in stakes races and shown at a certain point of your career, you're not quite at that level, your options can be limited going forward.
Yeah, I mean, that's the tricky part is when you're in that middle ground, when you're through your allowance conditions and you're not quite stakes quality, there's really nowhere to go a lot of times unless you want to put the horse in for a tag, which like Tom said, we try to avoid, unless it's absolutely necessary. So that makes it tricky when you have horses who are, better than allowance company, but not quite stakes company. There's a dearth of races for them. Tom, you forgot to mention the time we were at Belmont 5 minutes before the race and they canceled for air quality. That was a fun day.
I did. I actually forgot about that. That was, we've had a few, just one great thing about horse racing. And, this is my 16th year working with West Point as an employee, not just a partner as well. But just when you think you've seen everything, something happens almost monthly. I would say that we get on a call and say, what the hell happened there? I'd never seen that before. And, last night we had 2 horses running a Turfway. One was on her way over from the barn to the paddock and they canceled racing on us,
That's one of the things. I could do a whole podcast about that. Like, why can't these decisions be made earlier by racetracks? But we digress. There's another horse that's in a similar vein to Voodoo Zip that I know, Tom, you wanted to talk about from a couple years back. And that's Scholar Athlete. He kind of had that middle range where he could get through the 3X allowance, not really a stakes competitor. Can you tell us a little bit about him?
Yeah, I think when we have a few horses, and I think the common thread you'll see in these horses, Joe and Aaron, is they had great careers, that they're the perfect, when I say the perfect partnership horse, that's a horse that was sound and ran, and they didn't always win, but they ran, and the partners got to go to the races and go to big races and be a part of something. And, maybe they weren't true graded stakes type horses, but God, they were a lot of fun. Another one that comes to mind, I know one of Aaron's favorites was a horse named Awesome Vision. Awesome Vision was a New York bred that was just so much fun and, ran over the years. And you look at Scholar Athlete, he was from the first crop of Einstein for those of you who remember Einstein, he ran in the Breeders' Cup against Zenyatta, an awesome gem. He was a awesome looking horse, just like a Black Beauty type horse. But Scholar was an Ontario bred or a Canadian bred, so he was eligible to go up to Woodbine, and he was trained by Graham Motion when Graham had horses with us, and he really was a fun horse. He broke his maiden up at Woodbine, and you can see on the bottom there, he ran in a couple stakes back to back, and then he came back. I'm sorry?
Almost won the Queen's Plate, darn near.
Well, yeah, I think he came back in February at Gulfstream. He ran a couple times. We tried him in the the Palm Beach, and then we gave him a shot up at Turfway in the Rushaway, and then he came back down to Belmont. And you look at it, it was a really good price that day, and we ran huge. I mean, it was really I remember it was a beautiful sunny day, and he just ran phenomenal. And then we backed up and we worked backwards and we took a shot up at the Queen's Plate. And I think I'm not sure how many horses were in that race. It was a huge field, and I know we were third up until like one jump. Yeah, it was 13 horses, and Sir Dudley Diggs and Amy's Gizmo were both nice horses, and we ran a great fourth. And and at that point, we figured, okay, we'll move on and we'll take some shots. And we gave him some shots in some turf races, and he ran respectable all throughout his 3-year-old season. And we brought him back as a 4-year-old, and he started his year at Monmouth. And Graham got him a win right off the bench, come back again, run fourth, just beating the length. So here we are. We go to Saratoga, knocking on the door, competitive but not great. And lo and behold, he breaks through in Tampa. And for those of you who've never seen that race, December 23rd, 2017, the reason I remember it so vividly, I was out visiting my parents for Christmas. And if you watch the race live, you think he finished fourth. And I don't know how he won, but for those partners, for years, we talked about how did you win that race? It was literally a blanket finish, and somehow we got the nose down with Danny Centano. So he was really liking Tampa. We ran him back there again later on, and now we get to Belmont or Aqueduct, excuse me, in April, and we're back in the same scenario now, Aaron. We've won the 2 other than, we've won the 3 other than. I think we went in for the
Yep, you can see we're in for the tag. It's the Y. That essentially means
we win the 3 other than at Tampa. So now we're in for a tag.
Now you're in no man's land.
I'm sorry?
Now you're in what we were talking about with Voodoo Zip. You're in no man's land.
And the funny part is you'll see that he was entered for the Man of War, which is a grade 1. And we were talking about this off camera. The older turf horses in general, when you see horses like Channel Maker and Red Knight and these old timers that run in all these races, Cross Border was another. Ironically, most of them are trained by Mike Maker because he's kind of specialized in that division of claiming older horses. And there isn't a huge difference between an 80 claimer and a graded stake. They go back and forth sometimes. So the fact that he actually was entered in a grade 1, I think they looked at the race to see if it would come up light because we knew that he could go a route at ground. But, after that, here's where we struggled. We're in for the tag at each one of these times. And people at the time weren't really claiming grass horses. But he's running competitively, had a third by a neck and such. So here we are now on the 19th, August 9th of 19, we're in for the tag for 40 and he wins there. And basically at that point, we're looking at, we don't want to go any lower than that with this horse. He's been a fun horse for the partners. They've had a great run, but quite honestly, that's where he has to compete to continue his career. And Aaron, I mean, you've been involved in a lot of these racing decisions. At that point, I think we basically decided, let's, give him one more shot, give him a break. And he ran competitively, but that was basically the end of his career in January.
Yeah, he had started showing some wear and tear, and he had been, he had been good to us. And it was one of those things where at that point he was, gosh, a 7-year-old. Wow.
Yeah.
He was a 7-year-old here, and he came out of the race with some aches and pains, and we would have had to give him a few months off. So it wasn't really fair to him or the partners to think about like, okay, let's rest him and bring him back at 8, you know?
Well, I mean, just look at how consistent he was too. Like, other than that synthetic race, like those speed figures line up perfectly, and yeah, it just still can't break through at that level because he's basically gotten through the conditions that he's capable of winning, and it still can be a lot of fun, still can make you some money, but it's hard to take that step up from there, especially as an older horse. Let's jump back to a horse that's currently in the program that we're managing right now with Dallas Stewart, Brigadier General, who had a nice win at Keeneland in the fall, and he was under consideration briefly for the Clark Handicap. And then we also wanted to put him in an optional 80K claimer. Aaron, can you just talk a little bit about that? Because I think, like you were saying off air, a lot of partners found it confusing, like how he could be under consideration for the Clark and a race like that in the same 10 days or so.
Yeah. Well, I think it is more prevalent with turf horses, as Tom said. If you look, especially at a place like Kentucky Downs or even in the Breeders' Cup, some of those turf races, I mean, you will see horses who were running in high claiming races. The way that, the foal crops are and the way that the allowance races are structured is it pretty much, as we've talked about, once you get through the 3 other than, it's either claiming races or stakes. So you can have some really nice horses running for tags that just aren't quite at that level, and they switch barns and they tweak some things, and then suddenly they're running in stakes races. It's not a huge delta talent wise between those horses. So it is very weird, with Brigadier General. He's another example of a horse who's now through the 3 other than. Once you get through that 3 other than, it is very difficult. And I think his partners are seeing, we had him entered in 2 races this weekend, in fact. One at Oaklawn, which we didn't end up going because of the weather, and it was a pretty tough spot on the dirt. And then we put him in a race on the grass at the fairgrounds, which came up pretty salty. We do want to try the turf with him, but it's just not the right spot to try the grass. So we're going from being entered in 2 races to probably not running, because unless the race at the fairgrounds comes off the turf. What I think that shows is just how difficult and how, you have to get real creative with these horses who are, you're not quite ready to run them for the tag, but they're not graded stakes horses. He's not going to the Pegasus. And then the reality is these listed stakes do come up very tough. I mean, you have older horses who have won multiple races who are just trying to clean up in these $125,000 stakes. So he's probably the best current example of a horse we have that is a little bit in no man's land. I have confidence we'll find a good spot for him, but in a sense, when you win that 3 other than with a horse, you're super excited, because usually those races, I mean, let's see, it was a big pot. He won 77,000.
Yep.
But after a couple days, you're like, oh, now what are we going to do? But
Yeah. Well, and the optional claimer is like, if you can run in that same spot again, but then you have to be in for the tag, right? Like that's
yeah.
like one of the peculiarities of the optional claiming
So he
spots.
was actually entered for 100. So we entered him in this race at Churchill, an optional 100. That probably would have been a really good spot, but he was coming off a big number. He had run a 95 buyer at Keeneland, and we were just kind of hoping that he would take that next step, and he ran okay in his last start. But you're kind of in like that. We don't know that they're going to take him for 100, but all it takes is one person. And what if he does take that step forward and that 95 buyer is legit? So it's very much a blend of kind of art and science, and kind of playing the chessboard, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think when you're managing a partnership too, like you have to consider the partners. It's not just you're the one owner, and if the horse gets claimed, you're a little upset about it, but then you move on. Aaron, you could speak to that. Like we have people to answer to as well, and that I think that weighs on us. In addition to just finding the right spot.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And every trainer out there has had a horse get claimed from them that somebody else has taken and improved. You want to reduce the amount of times that that happens, you know, from an owner and a trainer standpoint, but it is going to happen. And where it does get tricky is with these salty older horses, because, you know, say this horse just keeps getting a little better and a little better, and suddenly a horse that's claimed for 80 shows up in the Pegasus. Like that's not, or a graded stake at Oaklawn or a graded stake at the fairgrounds. That is not as like, oh my God, it's not as much of an outlier as you would think.
Yeah.
Those
No,
are things we have to be careful of. We can't play scared. I mean, you can't manage horses out of fear, but you have to be thinking about those types of things.
right. Yeah, I think like just to use a general sports analogy, it's like if you let a guy go in free agency and he signs in your division and comes back and beats you twice a year, it looks bad that you let him go. But in these cases, really, there's no other option. Sometimes I want to move on and talk a little bit about the state bred programs, because these could be this could be an interesting way to kind of navigate those allowance conditions. New York bred program is obviously a big one. The Florida bred program. Aaron, why don't you can you talk a little bit about Chestertown? Because he was another horse that was fun for the partners, hit the board a lot, got a couple of wins, competed in some stakes, but he was a New York bred. So can you talk a little bit about the New York bred conditions vis-a-vis how they relate to the open conditions?
Yep, absolutely. So we see that Chestertown broke his maiden in December of 2019 at Aqueduct. And then the following summer, as a 3-year-old, he won one of Tommy's favorite races, the Albany at Saratoga. So essentially, that burned his New York bred first level condition. That winter, we came back and we ran in the New York bred 2 other than condition, the second level New York bred allowance. It's New York bred by this little S in the square. So a lot of state bred programs, in particular in New York, they want to incentivize you to participate in the state bred program. There has to be perks. And, one of the things is you get to be a big fish in a small pond, so to speak. Another benefit is you get to run and win a bunch of races before you face open company. So if you see here, this race on January 23rd is an open A other than allowance. So he was able to win a maiden race, a stake, and a New York bred allowance before ever having to face open company. That is a huge perk. Any other horse, let's just say a Kentucky bred, if they broke their maiden, they would not be eligible for these races. They'd automatically have to jump to this race, this condition on January 23rd. So it essentially gives you a free pass to win a bunch of races and then have to face open company. Because if the way this race is written, let's take a look. For 3-year-olds and up, which have never won 13,000 other than maiden, claiming, starter, or state bred allowance. So one little caveat to this is in the New York bred program, stakes races as that are restricted to 2- and 3-year-olds count as state bred allowance, but that's just nuance. So those state bred wins did not count against his eligibility here, which is just a really, really cool thing to have, and lets you kind of work your way up and develop a really nice horse. And then you see, after that, and the other thing is the state bred, when you buy a state bred, it's essentially like an insurance policy. We loved Old Chester, but the reality was he was a salty New York bred. Once he started in these open conditions, it was like, oh boy, he ended up winning the Open 2 other than the following winter, but you can see he went from winning a bunch of races and then the water got a lot deeper here. So that is
look at the numbers he's running, Aaron. Those are legitimate numbers. We joke about Chester. Obviously, Chester cost a lot of money, and that was the knock against him his whole career. But I look at his career and I say, he won the Albany, which is like the premier New York bred race in the summer. He ran in the Empire Classic. I mean, he had a great career. And he ran just super numbers. Just never broke through on the open stakes company. But one thing that pops into my mind is you say that you look at that race on January 23rd of 2021. That's an open A other than. Let's just say you had let's use Brigadier General as an example. And let's say Brigadier General had run once or twice and he broke his maiden. Brigadier General would go to the open A other than. Well, the open A other than, you might face a horse like Chestertown, who's already won 3 races. And, you know, it's sometimes like if you win first time, we always talk about winning first time out versus maybe running second first time out. But let's say you win first time out and you go to the A other than, and you run into Chestertown, who's already won 1, 2, 3 races already. And it's just a massive experience edge to that horse.
Yeah.
Yeah, and sometimes in these races, this race did not have an optional tag. But the other thing is you could say this was an optional 40. You could also have Brigadier General in there versus an older, salty 9-year-old who's won 15 races, who was in for the $40,000 tag. So
Yeah.
it's really hard when you have a very promising young horse. Then you have these old salts who have been there, done that. They've run everywhere. They've seen everything. They just don't, you know, they're in the claiming game. And that's where these races can be very difficult to handicap.
Yeah. Another thing I wanted to touch on is like the importance of confidence to a horse, because, you know, when you have a horse, like we were talking about this last time, when we have a horse in a claiming race, high tag, low tag, we're trying to find their competitive level and find their friends, so to speak. And horses, you know, when they are competitive and start being able to go past horses, you can kind of build on that as opposed to running them over their head and they're getting drubbed and they can't keep up. Like that can really wear on a horse over time. Like you bringing up Rock Me Baby here, you know, he broke his maiden for that $50,000 tag, and then he was in a starter allowance. We talked about starter allowances last time, which are restricted to horses that have been in for a tag in the recent past. And can you guys, I mean, Tom, you can take this. Can you just talk a little bit about, you know, how he was able to build that confidence before jumping in to deeper waters?
Yeah, absolutely. And he's a little bit different than most horses, just for the fact that if you look at it, he debuted in December of his 3-year-old season, correct, Aaron? It was his 3 or 4.
It had a bunch of physical issues, and we thought he had ability, but really the only reason we ran him for 50 is because we knew he would not be an enticing claim for somebody, because the red, you know, people would be like, what is wrong that he has not run until he was almost a 4-year-old?
Exactly. And he's a horse that, you know, we talk about the state bred programs. He was a Calbred, and you can look down on, you know, he wins the because he ran for the tag, the 50, it made him eligible for the starter. And a lot of the starters will be for horses, non-winners at 2, that, I mean, they've never run 1, 2 races, and they've run for a tag in their career. And for him, even if he hadn't won that maiden 50 and then he won a maiden special, he still would have been eligible for that starter race. And basically what that starter is it's a thank you condition. It's a condition to say, hey, thank you for running for a tag. Here's an allowance type race that you can't be claimed out of, but it's only open to other people who've run for a tag. So it's like, listen, you did us a favor. You filled this race. You ran for a tag. Whether you won or not, you're eligible now for that starter. And that was, if you look, we come back basically about 5 or 6 weeks later, he wins the starter, and then he's off to the races, and, you know, he can work his way through his state bred conditions. And as we got to like June, that BHP is the old Hollywood Park. So we were able to win the A other than, the 2 other than, and then the following year we were running in. We ran in the Breeders' Cup, the Eddie D, and we were competitive in both. And then won the California Dreaming and ran great was at the Bertrando. I mean, just what a career he had. And he was able to mix it between Calbred stakes and also some open company, and really was just a phenomenal horse for us. He obviously made almost $500,000 and didn't start his career until 2 weeks before his 4-year-old season.
I think he's a good example of, you know, you alluded to it earlier, Joe, like there's nothing in it for us to have a horse claimed after their first race and then go on and do well. Like we know that the partners want to have fun and see horses have long careers, but it's a calculated risk. Like by running for the tag, I think we gave the first time out, we gave this horse a lot of confidence, and not confidence for 1 start, but confidence for 2 starts. And just like Chestertown, he was able to win 3 races before ever running in an open A other than allowance. Now, if he were to be claimed out of this first start, he probably would have haunted us for a very long time. But on the flip side, if he would have ran in a maiden special weight first time out, who knows if he would have ended up having this career? Because he may have bounced around and run 3, 4, 5 times in those maiden races, which can be very salty, and run second, third, fourth, and just never really been given a chance to develop and win and be confident like he had. So it's definitely a balancing act.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like, it's a great point. Like, who knows what his career would have been if you had to throw him into these open maiden races, and he just got his head beat in for a couple races, and
Right.
yeah, he ended up getting on a nice roll because he took a calculated risk. He had those state bred conditions, and then eventually he got enough confidence that he was able to jump in to open company. One other thing we wanted to touch on the state bred programs, the purses can be different. The purses and the conditions can be different sometimes in open races. Tom, can you talk a little bit about the Kentucky bred races? Because at Kentucky Downs, sometimes you'll see these giant purses, but it's not necessarily every horse that's running for that money.
Yeah, it's certain states put a massive advantage for horses that are bred in that state. So, especially Kentucky, with the exception of claiming races, just about every race that's run in Kentucky non-state has the purse is heavily slanted towards horses that were bred in the state of Kentucky. So sometimes, like with Kentucky Downs, if we're going to take a horse and we're going to go run in Kentucky, let's say with a Clement horse that we've gotten from Europe, we know already we're probably going to be running for a little more than just half the pot. Now, sometimes those pots are so ridiculously strong, it's worth doing it. But for the most part, when we look at right now, the one that comes to mind is Florida, is Tampa. Tampa has finally brought their purses up to the 20th century, and we're starting to see, like yesterday, they ran a couple $53,000 allowance races at Tampa on a Wednesday. Well, it is a $53,000 race, and it's not, because there's a purse, and then it says in the parentheses, you'll see includes Florida money of XYZ. Like, yeah, Aaron will prove it up for you.
The maiden here's a maiden special weight. Yeah, 53. And
includes,
to make it easy for you now. So 53 includes 18, and then 18 plus 3. This is all Florida bred money.
Yeah. So at least they've been kind enough to not hide it completely. It tells you what the purse is if you're not a Florida bred. But we see that in the program, and we're like, we're running for 53,000 at Tampa. My dreams have come true, and lo and behold, we're really running for 32 if it's not a Florida bred. So
then in New York, it's different because here's your purse. Everybody runs for 80. But then if you're New York bred, you run for extra. You're not subtracting. So it's actually, you have to know what you're looking at with these condition books to really grasp what the purse is.
Yeah. The A other than in New York, like right below that, I think that's a New York bred A other than, but
yeah, right.
Just an open A other than, you'll see might be 80 or 90,000. And then lo and behold, you're going to be, oh, okay. Yeah. 84,000.
This is an open 2X.
So the purse is 84,000. If you're running Chestertown in that race, he's really running for 98.6.
Well, you could say Chestertown was still in training, though. Going back to what we were talking about earlier, Chestertown could run. He would just have to run for the tag.
Correct, the 62.5.
Yeah.
Well, and also like
and a good background.
I know, right?
So also there are conditions that sometimes you'll get if you're a state bred. Like I think about Cavu, who won this past Sunday, or maybe it was a previous Sunday, at Gulfstream, broke her maiden. She was in a maiden optional $40,000 tag race, but because she was a Florida bred, right, guys, she was able to run.
Exactly.
There's not a huge population of Florida breds. So, what they do, and they do this in Maryland as well, is they make it a maiden special weight and a maiden claimer in this, in this same race. So if you read it, it spells it out. 4 and up, Florida bred. or maiden claiming 40. So anybody, you know, who's 4 and up, a filly or mare who's a maiden can run, but if you're not Florida bred, you were in for the tag. So if you look at this, this was essentially a Florida bred maiden special weight. There was one filly in here, a Kentucky bred, who was in for the 40. So that's a nice, you know, in New York, you have quite a few New York bred programs, or New York bred horses. So you're able to fill flat out New York bred races. Where these other states that have good, robust programs, but maybe not as much of a horse population, this is a good way to make sure that your Florida breds have some sort of perk. There has to be a perk for, you know, being in a state bred program. And this is a nice thing that they do.
I think one additional thing that you've seen racing secretaries get a tiny bit creative of recently, especially with 2-year-olds, are the maiden auction races. And I think that's a huge addition to our sport in probably the last 2 to 3 years, Aaron, where, you know, what it is it's a maiden special rate, but it's restricted to horses that were purchased for under a set amount, whether it's 50,000 or 40,000, just depending on the race. But at Saratoga, they were running those, and it really gives you an opportunity to have a horse run for the big money at a major track and not have to run into that $1 million yearling or the Todd Pletcher $2 million Uncle Mo.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. You know, you may have a horse that you didn't pay a lot of money for who's showing a lot of ability, and you know, you just don't have to even think about running them for the tag, because that's what most people would have to do if they wanted to run at Saratoga. You know, even if you had a horse that showed they could run, in order to be competitive, you probably have to run in the 15 maiden claimer. So it just gives, you know, some of those horses who, for whatever reason, didn't bring a lot of money, it gives them a chance to develop and potentially be good horses, because they don't know how much they were bought for. So we do.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of in the same vein of the starter allowance. Like, it's a way for you to protect your horse and not have to run against the best of the best. And those horses turn out to be really nice sometimes. I think of British Idiom a couple of years ago for Brad Cox, filly by Flashback, and she cost about 45,000. Broke her maiden in one of those races, ended up being Breeders' Cup and then 2-year-old filly champion. So again, it's another way for horses to build confidence early in their career. Running out of time here. We got to get on and talk about all of our beautiful horses in a few. But this has been a blast as always. Thank you guys for the insight. We'll have a couple more horses that we want to get into, barn favorites that we've been trying to manage the last couple of years. So we'll save those for the next episode. But Aaron and Tom, thanks for coming on and thanks for all the insight.
Thank you, guys.
Next time we'll chat next week. Thank you.
See you guys.